Good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education here at the Southampton History Museum. Today, we're joined by Anne Halsey, who is a writer and a descendant of a lot of the Southampton families that we're going to hear about in today's talk. If you haven't been to Southampton before, you're going to get a really in-depth story about the North End, all about its history, directly from maybe one of the best sources you could find it from, one of the descendants of the people that live there. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A function or the chat function below. I'll pop back in at the end and I'll ask all the questions you might have for Anne. And hopefully everybody leaves today learning something new. So without any further ado, enjoy.
Thanks, Connor. So welcome. This is the first time that I have done a virtual tour like this, and I can't see y'all, so I'm gonna ask you to bear with me, please. I appreciate this opportunity. I had talked to Tom at the museum several years ago about doing a walking tour of the Old North End, which is where my family originally lived in Southampton. And then that there were conflicts when I wasn't able to do it then, and so over the last year, Connor and Tom asked if I would be interested in doing a virtual Zoom tour of the neighborhood. So this is a new thing for me, but bear with, I've got lots of information. I'm going to try to show you lots of slides, tell you some stories from my family, research that I've been doing for many years. And then at the end, if you have questions, if you have additional information, I'm guessing there are probably a few people on here that know more about the North End than I do. So please feel free to chime in and let's have a conversation. So without further ado, we will start here. For the first 8 years of the Southampton settlement, the Puritan Undertakers made their homes at the head of Old Town Pond, near the present site of Southampton Hospital. In 1648, they moved the settlement about 3/4 of a mile west, establishing the south end and the north end of the town, and began clearing lots and building houses along the south end of Ye Town Street. According to former Southampton town historian Abigail Fifian Halsey, the long main street of today, winding from the ocean to the woods, follows the general plan of Town Street of 1648, with the sea cast like a mantle around the little town. In 1651, John Jagger came to Southampton from Stamford, Connecticut, and was given by the town a 50-pound lot in the new North End neighborhood on condition that he would use the lot, use his trade to the best of his power for the use of the inhabitants. His neighbors there soon included members of the Sayers, Jones, Post, Halsey, Howell, Bower, Bishop, and Barnes families. Until 1664, when Job's Lane was created, Jagger Lane was the only way residents could get around the swamp at the north end of Agawam Lake to their farms on the Great Plain. And so this is going to be right over here. Here is the North End. Here's Job's Lane, Nugent Street, and this is Jagger Lane. And so that's a close up here. You can see we're right over here. And the first stop we're going to make in this tour is at the old post house, which is right here. The original part of the post house was built by the Post family in 1684. Like virtually all houses of that era, it was a farmhouse. According to Richard Foster, the farms along Main Street were long and narrow, and the land that was part of the Post farm very likely once ran all the way back to Woolley Street. The wing on the north end of the old post house was at one time a tailor shop, which stood down the street where the Morris photography studio stood. Here, when she was 18 years of age, Miss Eliza Post held a private school and taught her little neighbors of the South End. You're going to notice that there's going to be a theme throughout this about the various schools. I think that the museum has been celebrating the history of Southampton schools this year, so we're going to talk about a number of them. It was also the home of Dr. Silas Halsey, who was a physician in Southampton, who lived in the old post house before the Revolution. When the British occupied Southampton, Dr. Halsey fled to Connecticut, along with many other refugees. And while he was in Connecticut, his wife died and he lost everything that he owned. And so in 1780, he had to petition to return to Southampton. During that war, when the British occupied the town, there was great suffering, both for the people that were at home and the people who had fled. Heads of Long Island families fighting in the war were often killed, and their wives and children were left with insufficient means to last the years of the war, with their property on Long Island falling into decay or ruined by the British. Later, the post house became a hotel and boarding house, and in it lived my great aunt, Elizabeth Halsey White, who was a suffragist and a town historian. She and her husband, Edward P. White, who was the town clerk, lived there. This is probably in the 1920s. And there's the old post house decked out for the 4th of July parade. And this is Elizabeth. And many of the stories and many of the resources that I'm using today were originally written by her. And here's her husband. He was one of the people who got the town hall built, and there it was when it was first dedicated. And I know it's not the town hall anymore. I should tell you that I'm in Texas, and generally we come up to Long Island for a few weeks in the summer, but obviously last summer we weren't able to do that. So I have a few contemporary pictures, but most of the pictures that I have are archival. This is Edward during the 1915 historical pageant that was put on to commemorate the founding of the town. And this is Edward's father, Captain Hubert White. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and he was in the whaling industry for 40 years. He's a reminder of the earlier generations when every family boasted its sea captain and every boy looked forward to at least one voyage to sea. These were the days of the whaling industry, which made the life of this locality for so many years and which has given it a history both interesting and unique. Captain Hubie sailed 3 times around the world and spent 7 seasons in the Arctic. He doubled the Cape Horn 7 times and served in the Civil War. He had seen the seas piled high before the ship like stairs, with breakers as on the beach in the Oshkosh Sea. He'd seen tidal waves off the coast of Peru and water spouts in the tropics. He was in Honolulu when Commodore Perry returned there after his entrance into Japan. He married Sarah Elizabeth, daughter of Captain George and Elizabeth Jessup Post, who was born and died in the same room of the post house here. His grandson, Captain Edward P. White, is over here. Here is his granddaughter, Ibby, and his other grandson, Harry. But his grandson, Captain Edward P. White, was born in the post house also in 1895, and he followed the family tradition and went to sea at an early age. He wrote back many letters to Southampton, which are now in the collection of his grandson. And during many hazardous experiences, Captain Ed met emergencies with skill and prompt action. On one occasion, he brought his freighter through a hurricane off Cape Hatteras with an improvised jury rig when both engines failed. On another voyage, he operated on a sailor stricken by appendicitis with only a razor blade and guided by his radio operator, who kept in touch with a ship's surgeon some 500 miles away. Captain Ed performed the operation successfully. The sailor recovered, and a London surgeon who examined him a week later when they arrived in England complimented the captain on his neat work. I've had an appendectomy, and that circumstance sounds less than ideal to me, but he was quite a storyteller. His grandson has many, many letters and photographs from his adventures around the world. This is Abigail Fifian Halsey. She is the sister of Elizabeth, and she was a social worker, a playwright, an author, a teacher, and also the town historian. And she lived for many years with her sister and her sister's family in the post house. Like her other siblings, Abigail was very civically minded, And among other things, she was a member of the Red Cross. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. She started a home for unwed mothers and a settlement house up in Ithaca. And she also helped to start the hot lunch program in the Southampton public schools. During the last year, I've been particularly interested in a letter that was written to her while she was teaching in a school in Minneapolis from her young niece who was living in Southampton during the 1918 flu pandemic. This is the 7th of March, 1919 at 9:25 in the morning. A.B. White writes to Abigail, "Dear Babby, how are you? Do you wonder why I would write to you this time of day? Well, we have had to close school because there are about 150 cases of flu. Isn't it awful? This is the 3rd time we've had to close. I'm in Miss Monogram's room now, and I like her very much. Thank you for the stuff to make a dress. It is very pretty. Mother is going to make it like the one with the round collar and with the sash that ties in the back. This is some writing paper that Emily Bishop gave me for my birthday. I got 4 kinds of writing paper. Amanda and Joe and I have lots of fun skating up and down Mrs. Hildreth's sidewalk. I can go down backwards all the way. It's lots of fun. Boo has a very bad cold, so he has to stay in all day. Yesterday, Mother and I went to Aunt Edna's to supper. Well, I must say goodbye now. Lovingly, your niece, Ibby." And so here again is where we are at the post house. And we're now going to walk down Main Street to the home of Captain George White here at 159 North Main Street. On the northwest corner of North Main Street and Jagger Lane lived the legendary Southampton whaler and gold rusher, Captain George White, on the property formerly belonging to John Jagger in a 1699 farmhouse, which still stands. In 1832, George White shipped out at the age of 13 as a cabin boy with Captain Mercator Cooper. Later, he captained his own ship, and in 1849, he sailed around Cape Horn to California as a gold rusher, a venture which brought him some success, according to his granddaughter. The exact age of his house is unknown, though pegged beams and the boulders used in the building in the cellar have led its present or former occupants to assume that it was built sometime in the 1700s. Here is a photograph of Main Street. And this, it's a picture from a scrapbook, but this is Babby with her niece and her nieces and nephews in the old orchard that stood on North Main Street at the time. So here we're going to continue down. Go back to that map so I can show you where we are. So we're going to continue walking down this stretch of North Main right here. And about this neighborhood, early in 1700, this whole section this triangle was purchased by Abner Howell, who was the son of Colonel Josiah, who lived here on the Bowden property. Abner Howell divided it between his 2 sons. To David, he gave the south portion, which included the plot where in the 1840s, Captain Daniel Jagger built his home. And this is now the home of William, or was the home of William Donnelly. To Phineas Howell was given the north portion of the triangle, right here. On the west half of his lot, he built a tan yard, which afterwards he sold to Ebenezer Jagger and left to the village. In the earliest days of the village, the triangle of land bounded by Main Street, Bowden Square, and North Sea Road was common land for some time on every side that was occupied. So there was a long time in which this was really just a park. And then the Main Street part of the lot was purchased in 1788 by my relative, Anne Halsey, whose son Uriah lived across the street. And about the neighborhood, my great-grandfather writes, "We lived on the Main Street, which with several curves wound through the struggling business section and then straight away to the beach ocean. When the wind was south, the surf was always in our ears. We lived in the north end. Everything south of the church in Job's Lane was the south end. One village, 2 communities, more or less. each with its own two-room district school. To the south of the house was an orchard, Baldwin's, pippins, russets, with a few peach trees that seldom matured their fruit, and pear trees that always bore prodigiously. Little sickle pears for pickling, Bartlett's for eating, and Clapp's favorite for canning. A well-kept garden in the back supplied berries in variety and summer vegetables. Strawberries, which were raised in quantity, and asparagus, a half acre, were on the farm half a mile distant. The back break of cutting asparagus in the sandy soil, April and May days after school, is still with me after 50 years. These two crops furnished the only ready money until the fall crops of potatoes. He described the neighborhood saying, regardless of the direction of the highway, those houses were set by their builders, always facing the south and the sun and the sea. Farmhouses like that, gray and weathered, but trim and tight against the weather, some on village streets and some at the hub of surrounding acres. Tiny window panes peek out, diamond and square and oblong, most from the days when glass came from over the water and was priced in shillings and pence, and is bubble scarred and blue streaked and as enchantingly distorted as one peers out. Squat and square brick chimneys anchor the houses to the ground. Within these chimneys are fed by fireplaces, one in each and every room. Floorboards creak when you enter, boards half as wide as a puncheon head. Low ceilings, paneled woodwork, musical H and L hinges on gently squeaking doors. By the trim white churches surmounted by pointing spires, one comes upon ancestral burying grounds where rhymed epitaphs quarrel with life's adventure or attempt to perpetrate the excellency of some village worthy or mayhap his idiosyncrasies. So my great-grandfather, Jesse Halsey, was born here in Southampton in this home, and he died in Southampton in 1954. He was not particular, his mother died when he was 5 years old. And afterwards, he was mothered by several of the women in the neighborhood, but he was also sort of often up to no good and often in trouble, and he dropped out of school when he was in high school and went to work. And after about a year of that, then he realized that he wanted to be back in school and went back to school and then pursued his studies, ultimately going to Princeton to seminary and becoming a minister and a missionary for many years. And it's his writing also that I use a lot in this research. He wrote multiple versions of his autobiography, which included war work during World War I in Russia, and also several years as a missionary in Labrador. And he also took a lot of photographs. And so his photograph archive is something that I also have and use frequently here. Some of these pictures aren't so great, but you can see that this is North Main Street with the tree line. And this is 49 North Main Street, where Jesse was born and died, and there again with all the trees and the hedge. And so what we see here from his writing is that Southampton really, and especially the North End here, from 1640 up until almost 1900, was still very agricultural and very a quiet farming community. As the South End began to become more and more populated by the cottagers, as they were called, the North End really remained a neighborhood of farms and neighbors. So now we're coming up here to the North End Courthouse at 17 North Main Street, in the acute angle made by Southampton's Main Street and the North Sea Road. Here's Main Street and the North Sea Road, stands a picturesque gambrel roofed house half hidden beneath the trees. It is unmistakably one of the old houses of the village. There is an atmosphere of romance about it, both inside and out. Of late years, it has been called by some the North End Courthouse, not because of any legal hearings which are held there, but because of the number of maidens who've been courted beneath its peaceful roof. So wrote Elizabeth Halsey White over 100 years ago about what we know better now as the Herrick House, which was built in 1751. It continues to be occupied by the Herrick family, but according to an account left by William Pelletrew, it was built by a Howell during the Revolutionary War in the winter of 1778-79, when Long Island was occupied by the British. General Sir William Erskine, commander of the English forces on the east end of Long Island, made his headquarters in a neighboring house and took his meals in the Herrick House. General Erskine was remembered by the residents of Southampton for his fair dealings. The respect many bore him was no doubt enhanced when he decided to resign his commission before the end of the war out of sympathy for the Americans, it was said, with the American cause. It was only in 1835 that the house entered the Herrick family when it was bought by a whaling captain for his bride. In the dining room may be seen today the old fireplace before which the captain delighted to sit and recount the stories of his voyages. He made 17 voyages to sea in all. As my great-grandfather wrote, the streets were heavily shaded by big trees, mostly elm, as I have said. The old cemetery lay between our house and the first store. At night, when I had to run errands, I would get in the middle of the street, unless it was deep with mud, and run as fast as I could. The house next to ours was occupied by an eccentric old lady, the widow of a sea captain long since dead, and the place was terribly overgrown. Opposite hers was an elegant white mansion, the result of whaling prosperity, but now deserted and overgrown so that the street was a dark tunnel leading to the light shining in the window of Seeley's store. Beyond the spooky house of Captain Jagger, which would be right over here, was the home of our wonderful friends, the Herricks. Here lived my playmate and lifelong friend, Jack, his wonderful mother, who was also a mother to me, as Paul would say, as St. Paul would say, and his postmaster merchant father, the most Christ-like man you'll ever know, said my father. Mr. Herrick had a hardware store and put a lamp post on the triangle extended south of their house in front of the cemetery. A street lamp of the newest design, 1890, sat high on its post, new and shining green. Jack and I were commissioned to light it for the first time when it got dark. You'll never be rich if you use more than one match, we were told. Jack's mother, Hecky, as she was familiarly and endearingly called by all the neighborhood, made some custard, and Jack and I were detailed to freeze it. We started the process, but didn't use enough salt, so progress was slow and it got dark, time to light the new street lamp. We left the freezer, went out with our ladder, and with several neighbors looking on, lighted the new lamp, which stood for years in the triangle, throwing its rays down 3 roads and making the passage by the cemetery less perilous. When we got back, the ice cream had set, so we couldn't budge the crank, and it had to be removed from the freezer. The mixture stirred in a bowl, and the freezing process begun again. It was late when we finished, but the celebration was properly concluded. The street lamp functioned at private expense, the Herricks, until the coming of the first electric lights years later. Soon after, the Yorkers became fixtures. They were responsible for a village improvement association. Their first effort, as I remember it, was to lay a series of boardwalks along Main Street and Job's Lane for selected distances on either side of the street. Only 1 or 2 of the more substantial houses and stores in the village street had flagstone walks. These boardwalks were put down late in the fall and taken up after the spring mud had evaporated. They were rough boards, a foot wide, 3 of them nailed together parallel and then put down end to end in 16-foot lengths. It kept one's shoes dry, but when there was a heavy rain, they had enough motion to churn up mud puddles that would squirt up between the boards. It was great fun for the boys to run and jump along the walk on a rainy day to see who could make the mud fly the farthest and squirt the highest. And here is my great-grandfather with his friends Bill Bishop and Jack Herrick and Leroy Ruland, who also lived across the street. So these 4 men all grew up in the North End together and were lifelong friends. By the 19th century, the North End was a close community of primarily established families who held strict religious beliefs, coupled with superstitions and customs gleaned by years of seafaring. A poem written by Abigail Fifian, Jessie Halsey's sister, in 1917 captures the spirit of the neighbors. Here's the Herrick house today. Last spring, this is written in 1917. Last spring, we were all here. You at your music, Lee, composing, Jess at his preaching, George in Brooklyn working at his trade, Malcolm off in Canada, Ben in Cornell, Bill there in Hartford, Hampton training down to Bordentown, Ed just coming round the horn, the only one we called adventurer. Now look at us, Ben a lieutenant, Hamp a first, you and Bill and George all training hard in camp. 2 in New Jersey, 1 in Carolina, Ed taking grain to Italy and running through the subs, Jess gone to Russia, Malk to France. So we all out on the broad high road of life, our little neighborhood, our peaceful old North End. God keep the hearts that wait for our return. So this is something that I've been paying particular attention to as I've been conducting this research. As I said, my families came to Long Island in 1640 and really stayed put with a few exceptions until around 1900. It was in that time in which the family started to move to different places. And so I've been studying the changes that happened in the family once they moved from this very closed community where they lived for so long. And I think that that poem really gets at that moment when everything starts to transition. That brings us, this is an old map from the museum that shows the families where they first lived and then subsequent families that bought the property. So here we are on Main Street. Coming down Main Street, there's the triangle. Here's the where the Herrick house was. The street lamp would have been here. The creepy old house of Captain Jagger would be there. And here is where my great-great-great-great-grandfather in 1830 settled at 49 North Main. A few doors down at number 49, a cluster of homes on the triangle, which originally belonged to various members of the Halsey family, including Annias Halsey, is the house Captain Henry Halsey, captain of the local militia following the War of 1812, and not a sea captain, as were both of his brothers and most of his neighbors, built in 1833. Here's another view of that map coming down Main Street here. That's Annias Halsey, sold the property to Henry Halsey. Captain Henry Halsey was the oldest of 5. His father, Charles Fifian Halsey, owned a farm and was the miller in the windmill at Watermill and died in a really bizarre accident when Henry was 9 years old. There's the old Watermill. When the children were old enough, Henry's mother, Phoebe Rogers Halsey, moved him, his 2 brothers, and his 2 sisters from Watermill to New York City, where she kept a boarding house in the village and put the children in school. In 1830, Captain Henry, with his young wife Eliza and first child Charles, left his masonry business in New York and came back and bought a farm in Southampton from the estate of a deceased uncle, as the mill had earlier been sold to pay for his sister's schooling. Rebuilding the farmhouse and introducing some of the refinements that he had built in city developments, he settled down to work the farm and carry on his mason's trade. By 1870, he had succeeded Captain Bill White as the town's wrecking master. A house that he built on Grove Street is still standing, and apparently many of the interior features that he built in that house in Grove Street, he also built into the house at 49 North Main Street. Here is the house at 49 North Main Street around 1890. And Jesse was 5 years old when his mother died of pneumonia. This would be him sitting here as a child around that age. His father, his older brother, and his 2 sisters. This is, so it's hard to tell the date this picture. It's either his mother right before she died, or else it was his cousin who lived across the street. His father, Charles Henry, and his uncle, Charles Henry Halsey, and his uncle, Wilman Halsey, married sisters from Terrytown. They were Terry sisters, Melvina and Augusta Terry. And Charles Halsey and Melvina lived on one side of the street, and his brother and his wife's sister lived across the street. About 100 years ago, Main Street, Southampton was shaded in a canopy of great elm trees, which had been planted in the early 1800s. But in front of Captain Henry's home at 49 North Main were two giant trees of heaven, trees native to China. These were planted by Captain Henry in 1874, following the wreck of the French steamer La Vallée off the coast of Southampton. So tells Jesse Halsey. When the La Vallée wrecked, Captain ordered his men to board and cast off board the cargo, or part of it, in order to save the crew. Overboard went the cargo. Great bundles of fruit trees and shade trees were first jettisoned. These drifted up on shore and were being appropriated by the townsfolk when Captain Henry, knowing it was his business as wrecking master to save as much as possible for the ship's owners, went ashore and forbade his neighbors to take the trees away. He sent for a local squire who was always the auctioneer, and on the beach the trees were sold. Many orchards in Southampton were planted or replenished from this stock. And on either side of the front gate, Captain Harry planted a couple of Chinese ailanthus trees, a novelty in those days, because, he said, he was tired of nothing but elms. A dame school during that time was a private school for little children in the home of the teacher. The north end of the Halsey house, in a room which is now part of the kitchen, an addition was built for his sister, Miss Amanda's school. Opening out from the schoolroom was a dark stairway where her pupils were banished by way of punishment. While she was having recitations, they would pull off their shoes and steal to the kitchen chamber above and have no end of fun, as children do when they can find an attic to play in. Miss Amanda was engaged to a sailor. Before he set off on the 2-year voyage, after which they were to be married, the lovers planted grape hyacinths and daffodils in the back corner of the garden at 49. Year after year, she waited for her beloved sailor's return, but no word ever came of his ship, and she never married. As Jessie wrote, she taught the village school, loved every urchin in turn, her delicate sense of finesse and beauty often shocked by the rough seafaring realities of our village, but everyone revered her, and her romance was the secret pride of every sensitive soul thereabouts. Amanda, also known as Aunt Mandy, died of pneumonia on April 14th, 1880. She was 47. Her younger sister, Mary Halsey Rose, died in childbirth 6 years later at age 27, and they are buried along with their parents and their younger brother in the North End Cemetery, where we'll get to in just a bit. The flowers that Aunt Mandy and her sailor planted bloomed in that same spot for nearly 100 years. Mrs. Proud's dame school was on Windmill Lane, and Pelletreau says, "We wondered how Mrs. Proud could knit and see us whisper at the same time." An earlier dame school was kept by Aunt Polly Sayer, who lived in the old house that stood on the triangle in Bowden Square. Her husband had died and left her with 10 small children and little money to support them, so Aunt Polly opened a dame school. There was a big south room where all morning long the sun streamed through the tiny window panes. There, while Aunt Polly watched the dinner boiling in the kettle over the hearth fire, she heard the children say their ABCs and do their sums. Aunt Polly was remembered not because of her teaching, but because she let the children take naps on her bed when they grew sleepy. It was a beautiful replica of this house that attracted so much attention in the horticultural show last summer, wrote Elizabeth Halsey in 1930. It stood in the midst of an herb garden. Rosemary grew in the garden, and according to Aunt Polly Sayer, that was for remembrance. In 1932, the Daughters of the Revolution planted a Washington elm on the spot where the old house of Aunt Polly Sayer and her dame school used to stand in the triangle. Last time I looked, I could not find that marker. I don't believe it's there any longer. But it would have been, there's Mrs. Sayer's house. And the other interesting little fact about 49 North Main Street is that it housed the village's first library. In the same kitchen where Miss Amanda had her dame school, there was a bookcase that also held Captain Henry's book collection. And on Saturday nights, the villagers would come and gather around the old stove and exchange volumes. And before the Rogers Library was built. Here is now the corner at the North Main Street. So we're now looking at, there's 49 North Main Street. This is that triangle that would have had Miss Sayers' home on it in her dame school. This is an old logbook from when that property was all a farm. And here are some of the neighbors. During the Spanish-American War, the neighbors on Bowden Square collected and delivered milk and produce and loaded it on the train for Teddy Roosevelt's soldiers quarantined at Camp Wyckoff in Montauk. The Seaside Times in 1898 reported that the removal of Mr. Henry Clark's bottling business from its present location on Bowden Square to the newly acquired property nearby would probably place the old bottling stand in the market, and the paper implored the village to purchase the property, saying, "This place has been far more presentable during Mr. Clark's occupancy than ever before, but notwithstanding the improvements made there by Mr. Clark, it has been an eyesore for the last dozen years and probably always will be, as the place is too contracted to be made attractive with any number of buildings upon it. The house is old and nearly past its usefulness, and it is certain that the place could be acquired for far less sum now than after other builds have been erected upon it. The acquisition of this property by the village and the removal of the small buildings upon it would open up the east end of Bowden Square, making it a very attractive plaza adjoining Main Street, from which it is now cut off by this property. An open square at this place would be one of the first things to impress strangers arriving in town by rail, and would be the deciding element in influencing many a cottage hunter to locate here rather than elsewhere for the summer." The Bowden boys, Livingston and Leonard, and the Bowden family lived on the other corner of the triangle. Livingston was for many years the superintendent of the Southampton Ice Company, and they were both part of the North End gang of boys with whom my great-grandfather ran. This picture depicts many of those neighbors, including the Bowdens and my great-grandfather, who's over here with this stick, and they have just finished a fox hunt. So we see Nugents and Fowlers and Fordhams and Herricks and Terrys and Corwins. Across the street was the very popular Herb McCarthy's Bowden Square restaurant. This is in the 20th century. A legend in its own time, it attracted socialites, celebrities, writers, and hard partiers that would surround the famous Horseshoe Bar 3 Deep, which was said to host the most sophisticated drinkers in town. Opened in 1936, the menu featured steak, turkey, chicken, or roast beef at $1.50 and $1.75 a plate. Society orchestras and bands such as Lester Lennon, Irving Fields, Jan August, Hugo Padell, and the Three Bad Habits provided lively entertainment for guests from far and near. By the late 1950s, the menu included Montauk lobster, Long Island duck, local oysters, and Peconic Bay scallops. Owned and operated by Herb McCarthy, he was a saloon keeper straight out of Central Casting and was known to all as the man in the white coat. Patrons included the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Ginger Rogers, Gary Cooper, Henry Ford II, Irwin Shaw, Lee Radziwill, known then as Princess Razzle Dazzle, and the Gabors. Truman Capote, whose arrival supposedly elicited a shout of "Truman" from everyone in the restaurant, ate his lunch there every Monday in a corner booth. Herb McCarthy's was a scene, and according to the interior designer Judy Hadlock, back then Herb McCarthy's was the unofficial club to be seen at on a weekend night. The tinkling, clattering sound that filled the bar and dining room was magic. My great-grandmother begged to differ. Early in the 1960s, after her husband had died, she contemplated selling 49 North Main to McCarthy. She wrote to her son, If we had money to fix up everything and could stick by it and carry it through, no one of us would be able to live there, and it still would be next door to McC, which is not the association I care for my grandchildren, any more than for my children nor myself. We would not be able to attract the desirable tenants I'd like. If 49 were located in a different part of town, I'd never give it up, but the rear commotion has always bothered me. So I try not to let it hurt me too much, and rather than face the summer rental problem, strangers and no one to care for it, I decided to have a summer party. It will be 2 months before the papers will be ready, but then McC can go ahead with his parking lots. I haven't told the renter yet. She can stay there, McC said. They may move the bungalow to McC's lot, half a block where the tall building was. What a mountain of worry will be off of my mind. She was a teetotaler and a minister's wife, and she did not like the commotion that went on behind 49 North Main Street that everybody else enjoyed at Herb McCarthy's. We are now coming around here. Here's where Herb McCarthy's would be, and we are coming down Windmill Lane, which was part of the original town plan, then known as West Street. Windmill Lane runs from the old swampland north of Agawam, back here, and intersects with North Sea Road and Bowden Square in what is the heart of the North End. So we're right in here now. Around 1713, windmills, which ground the grist for the town, stood at both ends of Windmill Lane. According to Abigail Halsey, the first recorded schoolhouse probably stood in the West Street, Windmill Lane, opposite Jagger Lane and south of the present North End graveyard. After 1683, it housed the county courts as well as the village school. Be right in this area. When Jesse Halsey was a boy, the North Main Street in the spring was either a rushing torrent or a muddy slough. The melting snow all the way from Long Springs sought its hurried way to the town pond, or rather the swamp that then extended as far north as Captain George White's lot on Jagger Lane. I have gone from our back gate, so he would be here. This is some of his autobiographical writing. I've gone from our back gate in a rowboat all the way to the pond and could, of course, gone on to the beach. My playmate, Louis Hildreth, as we were sailing shingle boats from a footbridge, fell off and was swept away. I hollered with all my lungs, and Mr. Charles Selden Halsey ran down and pulled him out. We were about 5 years old. When the mud had gone and Mr. Dan Phillips had guided the road scraper through the village with 2 teams tandem pulling the machine, what the oncoming summer dust took the place of mud, and only after the Yorkers came was any attempt made to sprinkle the streets. The first watering carts were low box affairs made locally by George Culver or Andy Jagger that with a trap bottom backed into the town pond at Lake Agawam, and when they were full, the horses drew them out and the bottom closed. When they reached the proper place on the street, the driver opened the gate and the water ran out through some perforations in a pipe, leaving a trail about 6 feet wide. A limited area was patrolled, Main Street from the beach to Sealy's store and First Neck Lane, not much more. Later came the windmills installed by the Southampton Village Improvement Association, and big Studebaker cars that carried 1,000 gallons were circulated over a wider area. One of the big windmills was located back of our barn with an immense tank that furnished a bountiful supply, not only for the railroad watering cars, but piped into our barn and cow yard, watered our stock. Before that time, it was my daily duty after school to man the old log pump that stood by the back door and pump water that ran through wooden troughs to the barnyard. Ultimately, the water also piped into our house. These and other windmills disappeared gradually after the waterworks were built. The pumping station was in the north end of the village. At first, it was a pneumatic system. There was no standpipe as at present. In case of fire, the air pump was started and pressure pushed up. Everyone was very proud of the quality of the water. It never saw the air till it reached your faucet. Some of the city people had it bottled and sent to their New York homes. One enthusiast took a supply on a shipboard to Europe with him. Here now we're continuing down Windmill. There's the school. As very early in the history of the colonies, the early settlers established the church. They also made provision for a school. The first one was written into the books in 1643. In 1664, when it was ordered at a town meeting, the schoolhouse 20 feet long and 15 feet wide be built at the town's charge on the west street of the village. Here we are. The schoolhouse stood at the west street of the village at the rear of the home lot of John Jagger. The street, we are told, was not Windmill Lane, for the valley through there at the time was a continuation of the old swamp and full of water in time of freshnets. The street was further west along the hill, and the schoolhouse mentioned stood just about where the home of Gilbert White was, which is, I think, right in here. In 1767, a school was built on the west side of Main Street opposite Bridgehampton Road. In 1804, a new building was erected, which was later divided into the North and South End schools. The South End District number 6 school stood in Job's Lane, and the North End District 16 remained in Main Street until 1860, when a new school was built on Windmill Lane at a cost of $1,000. Here, there were men teachers for the winter months when the boys from the farms came in for about 4 months of the year, some of them actually grown men. And for the spring term, a woman was employed. Around 1885, some of the enterprising men and women of Southampton began to agitate for a union school, a school system including both district schools, North and South, and a public high school. Opposition was strong. In 1890, a second meeting was called. Those who had worked hardest for the new school were women who, 27 years before the 19th Amendment, voted with the men to ensure that the children of Southampton were given as good of an education as the state could give them. And then the Windmill School was built in 1891, which, see here, school number 16. As wrote Elizabeth Halsey White, many's the time we had been ferried from the foot of grandmother's lot on Bowden Square to the school in a rowboat, for there were times when the water became a broad and swiftly flowing river, and going to school was no longer a prosy, humdrum experience, but a real adventure. Though modern engineering has very nearly solved the problem of the freshlets, even now there are times when a big man with hip boots is a necessary ferry for the crossing of the children in safety. In spite of all this, the west side of the village has remained a center of learning for more than 250 years, and we hope it may be a long time yet before the old site will be abandoned. Continuing down, we come, so we would have gone past here and coming to the home of Captain Fowler, which looks today like this next to the cemetery. And Jesse Halsey wrote about his aunt, Libby Fowler, who was married to Captain William Fowler, a whaling captain, and Libby was Captain Henry's youngest sister. They settled there on the North Sea Road, just north of the cemetery. And Jesse Halsey wrote about her. Down our street lived a dear lady in a pre-revolutionary Dutch house. She knew everything. She loved everybody. We all went to her with our problems. I asked her once what the quick and the dead meant. There was a cemetery across the back street. She said, "You know what the dead means, and the quick means those who are very much alive." The schoolhouse of my beginning was on the back street, had 2 rooms, 2 teachers, and was not painted red. It was only gunshot from our house as the crow flies, and was approached by several legitimate routes. The quickest, however, was across a neighbor's garden, and in strawberry season, this made trouble. Better go around. Going around to Herrick's Corner, or more likely through their yard, one came to the front gate of Aunt Libby's house, snugly tucked in the trees, hard by the graveyard. Opening the latched gate, which always clicked, alone or in the company with Boubil, aka Robert E. Lee, a shinnecock friend who lived nearby, we came to the back door of the house, pausing long enough to get a cookie or a cruller according to the season, and then chasing on through her back lot as the last bell rang. 'Twas at the back door that I learned automatically to say thank you. Recess time often found me back. My father was Aunt Libby's favorite nephew, and I had special privileges. It was Aunt Libby who gave me my first bath and my first spanking in reverse order. She was the practical nurse and midwife of the village, the friend of all in need. Her husband had joined the 49 gold rush, mortgaged his farm, and gone round the Horn to California, coming home like many neighbors, broken in health and fortune. For generations, practically all young men had gone to sea, largely on whaling voyages with long absences of 2 or 3 years. 10 miles away was Sag Harbor, the port. Though every other man on the street was captain this or captain that, few longer engaged in the trade. Practically all had retired to their farms, though they still talked of the sea and could spin yarns by the hour. I remember hoeing corn, taking my row as a boy, with father on one side taking 2 rows and Uncle John Fowler, who said, "Oh, by golly," every other sentence, hoeing his 2 rows on the other, and both men slyly reaching over and hoeing mine whenever I got behind. Not far behind, however, because one wanted to keep within distance to hear the tales they were telling about the old Sabina that took a crew of local men to California in '49, or the old Cadmus when Uncle Jesse, a real uncle, was captain of the old Nokomis. All the boats were old. It was an epithet of endearment, not of chronology, I reckon. When mother died, it was Aunt Libby who came to my little bedroom under the eaves early in the morning to tell me. No professional morticians in those days, not there at least. And old Aunt Libby, who had ushered us all into the world and our parents before us. She was the practical nurse and midwife of the village, the advisor of its gentry and poor folk alike, the friend of all in need. Aunt Libby takes over, washing and preparing the body for burial. There was no embalming in those days, and Squire Foster acted as undertaker, making the coffin in his father's shop. Aunt Libby had a wealth of knowledge and a fund of stories. Sunday afternoons, I'd slip over to sit with her, and sometimes she would let me take a tiny pinch of snuff out of her whalebone snuff box. 3 of her boys went on whaling voyages and had been lost at sea. Willie and Eddie Fowler were never heard from, my great aunt, telling me in a moment of confidence one day that though they had been gone for 50 years, her gate never clicked, but that she went to the window or the door to look and see if they might yet be coming home. From the Fowler's house, we're going to continue our walk and finish up here in the Old North End graveyard. The cemetery was the only place my great-grandfather was allowed to stroll on a Sunday. And walking that little bit there from Aunt Libby's house to the graveyard, back to his house at 49 North Main, one winter's day, he was reminded of that dear lady, old Aunt Libby Fowler, whose house we just passed, and remembered her in the dead of winter pointing out the beauty of the bare trees, which I think, given the story of how her 3 sons all went to sea and never came home, is very poignant. And the poetry that it sort of is encapsulated in this space in so many ways over multiple generations is also very interesting to me. I do see that we are getting close to an hour, so I'm going to wrap up here with a little bit about the North End Graveyard, and then I'd be happy to take questions and have a conversation. Again, this is my great-grandfather, Jesse Halsey, writing about the neighborhood. Another way to school, much used after the Union School was built a few rods to the south of the old North End District building, led through the graveyard. There were stiles at either end and a winding path road between them. The cemetery stretched from road to road and made a quick route to school, much used by the boys, but avoided by all the girls, save the bravest, for it was badly overgrown, seldom used for internments, and inhabited by snakes. They were largely of the harmless garter variety, but eagerly sought by the boys during recess, and on occasion, by some mysterious progress, found themselves in the desks at school. This was called the old cemetery, or more often graveyard. The new cemetery was bought by my father and his contemporaries just before mother's death, and she was the second to be buried there. It was an open field then, and I can remember going there with father to cut the grass with a scythe. He had put a rail fence around the grave to keep the cattle away, and over the mound bought a rough frame that he kept covered the first summer with oak boughs. The clouds are chasing across the moon's half round. The sycamores sway in the February wind. No snow is on the ground, but all is chill. The air, the windswept brown turf, and the white bark trees, all chill, but the wind-swept moon is cold. I remember as a boy such a night. Clutching my father's hand, we came out Aunt Libby's gates. It clicked behind us. Past the old burying ground we walked. I glanced at the stark headstone of my grandfather's grave just by the gate. The clouds were scuttling across the moon, nearer full that night, and in the east, the wind was southwest chill and salt-laden. You heard the steady boom of the surf, beating in deep undertone and rhythm on the island's shore. And that concludes my virtual walking tour of the Old North End. Connor?
All right, that was great. Yeah, we're at just about an hour. If anybody has any questions, comments, anything like that, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. If you're on your computer, you move your mouse around at the bottom, you'll see they'll pop up. If you're on your phone or an iPad, you might have to click like the option or more button, and you'll be able to see them and type in any questions you might have. Let's see, we have a handful in here already. So let's see. First, we have somebody saying, "Hi, cousin Anne," or at least a very distant cousin. They said that their ninth great-grandfather is Richard Post, one of the early settlers, and they currently, I guess, live in Los Angeles. And their question was, they were asking if they can get a copy of that handwritten map with all the property owners on it. I believe that's the William Pelletreau map they're referring to.
Yes. That map is actually in the Southampton Museum. So mine is a photograph of a close-up, a detail of that map.
Yeah, so we actually have that map in our collection at the museum, and we're in the process right now of trying to digitize a bunch of our maps so we can sell some copies and stuff like that for people who are interested. So I believe we're waiting to get them scanned because we don't have a big scanner, so it's a little bit of a process. But if you sign up for our mailing list, you'll be notified right away as soon as we have those added to our online store. Then you could maybe order yourself a copy. I know it's super handy to have if you're a researcher. I refer to it almost constantly.
Yeah, it's really fascinating the way that it stacks all of the different owners on each property.
We're pretty lucky that Pelletreau in the 1800s was like, let me just write this all down right now.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't always do that so accurately in the past. Let's see. So we have some other questions coming in. Could you tell us anything more about Jess's World War I work in Russia?
Sure, that's a great question. I actually have been working on transcribing a diary that he kept while he was there. He was at the time the minister of Seventh Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati, which was a very affluent parish there in Cincinnati. Many of the people from the industry there, like Proctors and Gamble's, the founder of Windex, et cetera, were members of his congregation. And so he really wanted to enlist in the war, but he was a little too old to do so. And so he got connected with the YMCA and the Red Cross. Actually, this goes a little connection back to Southampton. Oh man, I'm gonna forget his name now. He led an expedition. He was a statesman and a senator, and he led the expedition into Russia first for Wilson, who had been Jesse's teacher when Jesse had studied at seminary at Princeton. And so through this connection and through Wilson, he signed up and was in the first cohort of people that went with the YMCA into Russia in the fall of 1917. So he arrived in Moscow right as the revolution was happening, and he witnessed the revolution those 10 days in October, November of 1918. And then later he went up to Murmansk and worked there. And there's many stories involved with people he helped to get out of Russia and a number of things. So I'm working on transcribing that and putting together photographs of it. If you're interested in hearing more about that, you're welcome to contact me. I'd love to talk about it.
Maybe we'll have to do another lecture on just about World War I in Russia.
Mhm. There's a lot. He
um,
kept amazing records and scrapbooks and wrote, he just, he was a prolific writer. He
yeah,
wrote, he was in the habit of writing Sunday sermons. And so he also wrote reminiscences. And on his way to Russia, he wrote many reminiscences of his childhood in Southampton, and as well as documented what was going on around him.
that's amazing. So that same person also asked, you had mentioned somebody dying in a bizarre accident. Do you have any more details about that, or?
Yeah, so that was one of the great great grandfather that was the miller of the windmill at Watermill, which is a little bit of a tongue twister to say. And so I believe what happened is that there was a storm and he went out at night and the windmill actually collapsed on him. I read that once years ago, and I have been trying to find the source in which I originally read that, and I can't find it again. But I think in my head that's what happened. Um, and so then his mother took the children to New York City. But that's the recollection that I have.
Gotcha. So let's see. Next one doesn't. It's not exactly a question, but they said that this was amazing. Your Halsey Hedgelson blog was basically the reason I moved back to Southampton. My father owned the post house, and I grew up on 34 Post Crossing, which Elizabeth built. I'm obsessed with Elizabeth and Abigail. Such a great woman, ahead of her time. Thank you.
Oh, that's very sweet. So this photograph that I showed earlier um, is actually when they sold the post house and the family moved back early. This one. So this is at 34 Post Crossing after they moved from the post house. So this is Lisbeth and her sister Abigail, Edward Post White, and my great grandfather Jesse Halsey. And they're wearing the white of the suffragettes. And they, after they got the vote, then they helped found the League of Women Voters.
All right. So let's see. We have somebody else asking. My oldest ancestor is Elias Cook, who came from Lynn in 1640 and was a carpenter. I'm trying to find a record of his father. Okay, so not exactly a question, but yeah, I would say what you could do is you could contact us here at the Southampton History Museum, and our research center manager, Mary Cummings, might be able to help you doing any sort of genealogical work you might have. Also, the Rogers Memorial Library has a lot of great stuff, and they have somebody on staff that does a lot of good genealogical work. So both of those are good options. Um, let's see. Moving down the list. We have a lot of people just saying thanks, and this was a great time and stuff like that. Let's see. Here we go. Hi. Would it be possible to get a copy of the letter about the Fowlers? I have 10-month-old twin Fowler boys, and we live on North Main Street, and would love to give it to them one day. We didn't know any of Fowlers lived on the North End.
Yeah. So she was the youngest sister of Captain Henry, and she married Captain Fowler, and they moved over there, which I think is now, again, I'm in Texas right now, so I think that's right about catty cornered across from Tate's Bake Shop, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is always the stop that we make in Southampton. One of the stops that we make. Yeah, that is a newspaper article that is from an old edition of the Southampton Press, but you are welcome to contact me. My email address is Halsey, Halsey, Anne, ANNE, @me.com. It's also on my blog, the Halsey Helgeson family tree blog, and there, send me an email and I will send you a copy of the newspaper article.
And if you have trouble contacting her, you can contact us here at the museum, and I can always put people in touch. Seems to be the majority of my job sometimes. So let's see. We have a few more. We got a lot of questions coming through. So let's see. They mentioned you mentioned that you're located in Texas. What part? I'm a Halsey descendant, and I live in Oak, Texas, in East San Antonio, and I very much enjoyed the webinar today.
Oh, thanks so much. I live in San Marcos, just north of you. My husband is a history professor here at Texas State University. So I hope you didn't get the same baseball-sized hail that we got last night.
We have somebody else asking, what was the date of the street maps that you were showing? I recognize a few of them, but I always get them mixed up in my own head.
So one of them is a little bit older, and let's see.
I believe at least one of them is the 58 map. I
Yeah,
can't
you're gonna
remember.
probably have these numbers better than I do. Um, this is the more recent one, I think.
Yeah. This one I can't remember exactly the year of this one. But I believe the other one that has this one here, I believe is the 58, I want to say, which it might be kind of similar. It looks to be the same. Might be
I mean,
73.
that was the detail of this one.
Yeah.
The other one is the older one. This is the older one.
Okay, I think this might be the 58 one, and the other one might be like 73. We're talking 1800s here.
Yeah.
Um, Fairly confident on that, on my guess, just from looking at these a lot. But I have dyslexia and I look at a lot of maps, so I mix numbers up all the time, which is why I always write them down.
But these are from the Southampton Historical Collection, and I know that there are copies. This is a photograph again of a detail that I took, but I own one of the copies of the map, and the gift shop, if you've not been at the Southampton Historical Museum, is fantastic, and has lots of these maps for sale.
Going through this really quick, just to see these other questions. Someone's asking if this talk will be on YouTube. Yes, it will be on YouTube. So if anybody else is doing research or things like that and wants to refer to this, it'll be on YouTube very soon. Probably watching this on YouTube right now. Hello, how are you? And I will also be sure to connect to anybody that has to ask Anne any questions. Oh, we have here Julie Green is in the chat. She's the Southampton town historian, and she confirmed yes that 1873 and 1858. Oh, got the numbers right on the maps. And let's see, that's all I have in the Q&A. And I have a few in the chat. A lot of thank yous. This is a great talk. Somebody asking about the map. Let's see. My great grandmother was Elizabeth Culver. Do you have any insight into the Culver family?
I don't. I think that my dad's mother was a Rayner, and I think that there is an intersection with the Rayners and the Culvers. Certainly with the duck farm that the Rayners had eventually was purchased by the Culver family, but I really haven't spent a lot of time studying that side of the family. It's really been focused on Jesse Halsey and the 10 generations back with that. So. But the museum probably has information on the Culver family.
We very well might. You could always contact us. We can see what we have, and if we don't know, could pass you on to Julie Green over at the Southampton town. She might know, or somebody at the library. It's usually a good guess to ask all three of us and see what we can all find, because we do share a lot of information, but there's so much information, it's kind of hard to share it all so easily. So it usually takes somebody asking the question, and that's when all three of us will end up making connections with what info we all might have, which is always really great. So yeah, please don't hesitate to contact the museum. Go to our website, southamptonhistory.org. You can find our phone number, address, all the emails and everything for all the staff at the museum. You can contact any of us. And you can also go to our calendar page and sign up for all of our future programs. So you can come and ask all the questions you might have about those, just like we did here today. And I want to thank Anne for joining us this morning, doing this great talk. We have a lot of people still in here. Normally you have a lot of people sort of bail out at the end for the Q&A, but we have a lot of people still enjoying and listening. So thank you for everybody that joined us today. And Anne, do you have anything else to say before we go?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great fun. I just looked into the chat, and I can see that my cousin Joe Haratunian is there and mentioned being in 49 when he was a child. This picture, so Abigail wrote poems, Jesse wrote poems, Elizabeth also wrote poems. Many people painted, including Jesse painted, as did his wife Helen. And their middle daughter, Helen Halsey Haratunian, who was married at 49 North Main Street in the summer of 1942, and is the mother of Joe Haratunian, was also an amazing painter, painted many scenes in and around Southampton. And she is featured with some other family members in some video in one of the posts that I blogged for at the museum. So there are 3 more blog posts at the museum website, if you haven't seen them, that have some of this information, but some additional information, as well as old family films and photographs. So,
Yes, if you
thanks
go to
everybody for coming.
southamptonhistory.org/blog, and if you search North End, it'll probably come up, or if you just scroll around through there in the history talk section, you'll find the information Anne was just talking about. And yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, sitting through this talk and enjoying all the history. I want to thank Anne for providing the talk and doing all the research. It's been really great. And we'll see you all next time. Thanks,
Thanks so
everybody.
much.